Do you remember the moment you stopped replying? Was it exhaustion or something colder than fatigue? Did the room grow quiet or did it finally tell the truth? Imagine a lamp left on in an empty room, humming softly, illuminating nothing and everything at once. The first thing you must understand is this. The problem was never only the people you cut off. It was never just the noise, the demands, the misunderstandings. The deeper mechanism was already moving long before the silence arrived. The true conflict was between the ego you used to survive and the self that has been quietly waiting to take over. You did not walk away because you were weak. You walked away because a psychological threshold had been crossed. In today's video, we will move slowly through that threshold. We will not moralize it. We will not romanticize it. We will descend into the inner architecture that produces the decision to disappear, to sever, to go quiet, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of psychic necessity. Are you ready to see what is actually happening when someone cuts everyone off? Number one, the persona collapses before the ego can explain it. The persona is the mask you learned to wear so early that you forgot it was a mask at all. It is the agreeable face, the competent voice, the one who understands, who adapts, absorbs. It is not false in the childish sense. It is functional. It exists so you can belong, but every persona extracts a price, and the price is paid in psychic energy. When that energy runs out, the mask does not gently loosen, it cracks. Picture a mirror with a fine fracture running through it. At first, the crack is invisible unless the light hits it just right. You keep standing there, adjusting your posture, smoothing your expression, pretending the reflection is whole. But one day, the mirror breaks entirely, and you are left holding shards. That moment is not dramatic on the outside. On the outside, you simply stop answering messages. Someone texts you something ordinary. You read it. You feel nothing rise, no warmth, no irritation, no obligation, just a flat inner silence. At work, a colleague makes a familiar request, and you nod, but something inside does not move. At home, family voices feel distant, as if traveling through water. You begin to cancel plans without guilt, not because you are healed, but because the persona no longer has energy to perform. Consider Elena. She was known as reliable, emotionally intelligent, always present. For years, she held space for everyone else's chaos. One evening, after a minor disagreement with a friend, she sat alone in her kitchen and felt something new, not anger, not sadness, but absence. The next morning, she did not reply. The day after, she muted more conversations. A week later, the quiet felt safer than connection. She did not feel cruel. She felt empty and relieved at the same time. That relief confused her more than the silence itself. Jung would say that when the persona over-identifies with adaptation, the ego becomes exhausted in service of an image that no longer corresponds to the inner truth. The psyche does not negotiate forever. When the ego refuses to adjust, the unconscious enforces withdrawal. That is why the cutoff often feels sudden, even to the person doing it. And once you see this, you begin to sense that silence was not avoidance, it was collapse. Take a quiet pause. Breathe more slowly. The next layer is more uncomfortable because it exposes the role of control. When you cut everyone off, it looks like surrender. Psychologically, it is often the ego's final attempt to regain sovereignty. For years, your ego maintained equilibrium by managing expectations, smoothing conflict, preempting rejection. It learned that if you could anticipate others, you could survive them, but control through adaptation is still control, and it is still exhausting. Imagine a dam holding back water. The dam represents your ego structure, rigid, vigilant, constantly monitoring pressure. Behind it, the water rises, unexpressed needs, swallowed anger, unlived impulses. Eventually, maintaining the dam requires more energy than letting it break. So the psyche chooses rupture. The cutoff is not passivity, it is the dam opening all at once. This shows up in ordinary moments. You stop explaining yourself, you stop clarifying intentions, you stop defending your boundaries verbally and enforce them through absence instead. Someone accuses you of being cold, and you do not correct them, not because they are right, but because the ego is done negotiating its own legitimacy. Mark experienced this after years of being the understanding one in his family. Whenever conflict arose, he mediated, reframed, absorbed blame. One holiday, a small comment triggered a surge of internal pressure he could no longer contain. He left early without explanation. In the weeks that followed, he answered no calls. What surprised him was not the anger from others, but the sense of power that returned with each unanswered ring. For the first time, his nervous system was quiet. Jung believed that the ego, when overwhelmed, will attempt to restore balance through extreme measures if subtler adjustments are ignored. The cutoff is an extreme boundary created when symbolic boundaries were never allowed to exist. That is why the silence feels non-negotiable. And yet, this is not the deepest layer, because beneath the collapse of persona and the reassertion of ego lies something darker and more transformative, the shadow. The shadow is not what you did wrong, it is what you were never allowed to be. Every time you swallowed resentment, every time you chose understanding over truth, every time you forgave too quickly, the shadow grew heavier, and the rule is merciless. What you avoid will grow in the dark. Think of a locked basement beneath the house. You can live comfortably upstairs for years, convincing yourself the lower level does not matter, but the house is still built on it. When cracks appear in the walls, they originate below. In daily life, the shadow announces itself subtly. You become irritated by people who need too much. You judge those who express anger freely. You feel contempt for weakness, even as you deny your own strength. These reactions are not moral failures. They are signals of disowned material pressing for recognition. Sarah's story illustrates this. She prided herself on compassion. She believed anger was destructive. Over time, she found herself cutting off friends who complained, who needed reassurance, who leaned on her. She told herself she was protecting her peace. One night, during a journaling exercise she resisted for months, she wrote a single sentence that shocked her. I am furious at how much I have given. That sentence did not make her cruel. It made her honest. Jung would say that When the shadow is denied conscious expression, it will manifest through unconscious action. Cutting people off is often the shadow enforcing a boundary the conscious ego was too moral to claim. And once you see this, the narrative shifts. You are no longer the victim of others' demands. You are the custodian of a neglected inner life. Take another quiet pause. Let the image settle. This is where projection enters, and where the story becomes dangerous if misunderstood. For a long time, you may have believed that others were draining you, controlling you, misunderstanding you. Some of that may be true, but projection operates most strongly where there is emotional charge, the traits you could not tolerate in yourself: neediness, dependency, rage, selfishness. You perceived everywhere else. By cutting people off, you were not only escaping them, you were escaping parts of yourself you had never integrated. This is why the silence can feel clean at first, almost sacred. The projections disappear with the people, but the psyche does not allow permanent exile. Withdrawn projections return inward. When they do, you may feel restless, unmoored, unsure of who you are without opposition. Daniel reached this stage months after his social withdrawal. At first, the peace was intoxicating. Then came the dreams, arguments with faceless figures, rooms he could not leave, voices he could not identify. He realized the conflict had not ended, it had moved inside. That realization frightened him, but it also marked the beginning of something else. Jung believed that psychological maturity requires the withdrawal of projections and the acceptance of one's own shadow contents. This is not a punishment, it is an initiation. And that is why this process cannot be rushed, moralized, or interrupted prematurely. If you are still with me, stay with me until the end, because what comes next is not about isolation or return. It is about individuation, the movement toward your center. But before we go there, you must understand one more thing about the cutoff itself. It is not the destination, it is the threshold. The psyche does not destroy connections unless it intends to rebuild them differently, first within, then without. The quiet room at the beginning was not emptiness, it was preparation. And once you see this, the next layer begins to reveal itself. When the silence stretches on, something unexpected begins to happen. The mind, deprived of its familiar mirrors, starts to turn inward, not gently, but insistently. The quiet room you entered is no longer merely calm, it becomes reflective, almost interrogative. The lamp that once illuminated nothing now casts shadows on the walls you had never noticed before. Number two, withdrawal becomes a confrontation with the ego itself. At first, the ego celebrates the cutoff. It tells itself a clean story. You chose peace, you chose boundaries, you chose yourself. And on one level, this is true. But the ego is also a storyteller that prefers coherence over truth. In isolation, with fewer external roles to manage, the ego loses its usual distractions. There are no urgent replies to craft, no emotional negotiations to navigate. The ego turns around and sees itself. Imagine standing at the end of a long corridor lined with doors, each labeled with a role you once played: friend, child, partner, colleague, rescuer. You closed those doors to find relief, but now At the end of the corridor, there is a final door with no label at all. This door does not lead outward. It leads down in daily life. This phase feels subtle but unsettling. You may wake up without anxiety, yet also without direction. Your calendar is empty, but your thoughts are not. You notice old memories surfacing without invitation, moments where you swallowed words, moments where you were praised for being easy, moments where your needs were minimized and you agreed too quickly. The ego, stripped of performance, starts to review the cost of its strategies. Consider Thomas. After cutting off most of his social circle, he enjoyed weeks of uninterrupted calm. Then, during a quiet afternoon, he found himself replaying a childhood scene, standing in the kitchen while his parents argued, learning that staying silent kept him safe. He realized that his adult withdrawal carried the same logic. The cutoff was not just a boundary, it was a survival reflex carried forward in time. This insight did not shame him, it softened him. Jung would say that the ego, when no longer propped up by persona, is forced into dialogue with the unconscious patterns that shaped it. This dialogue is rarely comfortable, but it is necessary, and once you see this, you begin to understand why some people cannot tolerate long silence. It exposes the ego's borrowed architecture. Take a quiet pause, let your breath deepen without effort. As this confrontation unfolds, another figure enters the room, the shadow, now less symbolic and more personal. The shadow does not arrive as rage alone. Often, it comes as grief, grief for the self you never fully inhabited, grief for the honesty you postponed, grief for the life force you traded for acceptance. When you cut everyone off, you also cut off the constant reinforcement of who you thought you were. The shadow steps forward to claim what was left behind. Picture a river that was diverted years ago to power a city. The city thrived, but the original riverbed dried up. Now the diversion has stopped. The water begins to find its old path, slow and unpredictable, reshaping the land. The shadow is that returning current. In ordinary moments, this shows up as emotional waves that do not match present circumstances. You might feel sadness while doing something neutral, anger without a clear target, longing without an object. These feelings are not regressions, they are messages long delayed. Maya experienced this during her period of isolation. She had cut off friends who leaned on her emotionally. One evening, while doing nothing in particular, she felt tears rising. There was no crisis, no trigger. As she let the feeling move through her, she realized she was mourning how often she had been strong when she wanted to be held. That realization did not push her back into old patterns. It gave her language for what she would no longer abandon. Jung believed that the shadow contains not only what is dark, but what is vital: strength, assertiveness, desire. Even joy can become shadow when they threaten a fragile persona. When these qualities are reintegrated, the personality does not become harsher, it becomes more whole. And this is where projection begins to reverse. Without constant interaction, you start noticing how your judgments of others were often mirrors. The people you labeled as demanding carried your own unmet needs. The ones you saw as intrusive mirrored your difficulty saying no. As projections withdraw, something remarkable happens. The emotional charge around others diminishes. Even in their absence, this does not mean you rush back into contact. It means the internal battlefield quiets. The enemy dissolves because it was never external to begin with. Lucas reached this stage slowly. Months after his cutoff, he ran into an old friend by chance. Instead of tension, he felt neutrality. He did not need to explain himself or reconnect. He simply noticed that the friend no longer triggered anything intense. The projection had been reclaimed. The encounter ended politely. Without drama or longing, Lucas walked away feeling strangely grounded. Jung would say that withdrawing projections is one of the most difficult tasks of psychological development. It requires humility, the willingness to see that what disturbed you outside was activated inside. And once you see this, the silence changes character again. It is no longer defensive, it becomes contemplative. This is where individuation begins to whisper, not as a concept, but as a direction. Individuation is not isolation. It is differentiation, the process by which you become distinct without becoming disconnected. The cutoff created space. Individuation teaches you how to inhabit it. In this phase, practices emerge organically, not as self-improvement, but as self-listening. You might begin writing without agenda, letting thoughts spill onto the page until patterns reveal themselves. You might notice bodily sensations when certain memories arise, learning to read the body as part of the psyche. These are not techniques imposed from outside, they are responses to an inner call. Anna found herself sketching during her isolation, something she had not done since childhood. The images were unplanned circles, doors, figures standing alone but not lonely. Through these drawings, she accessed emotions she could not articulate verbally. The activity was not productive, it was truthful. Jung believed that individuation unfolds when the ego aligns itself with the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche. The self does not demand performance, it demands attention. That is why the cut-off cannot be the final form of your life. It is a liminal state, a cocoon. If you remain there too long, stagnation replaces growth. If you rush out too quickly, the old patterns resume. Timing matters, and timing is internal. And once you see this, you realize that the question is no longer, who did I cut off? But who am I becoming without the mask? Take another quiet pause. Let the image of the quiet room transform. It is no longer empty. It is spacious. We are now approaching the inward turn, the moment where projection fully collapses and responsibility returns to its rightful place. This is not blame, it is authorship. The inward pull now becomes undeniable. The room you entered is no longer a refuge from others. It has become a chamber where you meet yourself without witnesses. The lamp still hums, but its light has shifted. It illuminates not the walls, but the center of the floor where something has been waiting. Number 3, the psyche demands the withdrawal of projection and the naming of the shadow. Up to this point, silence protected you. Now it questions you. When external noise fades, the unconscious speaks more clearly, and it does not speak in abstractions. It speaks in sensations, impulses, image, dreams. This is the phase where many people panic and break the silence prematurely, rushing back into old connections just to drown out the voice within. But if you stay, if you remain, something precise begins to happen. Imagine standing before a cracked mirror, the same one from earlier, but now you do not turn away. You look directly at the fracture. You realize it is not damage inflicted by others. It is the line where two selves diverged long ago, the adapted self and the authentic one. The shadow lives in that line. In daily experience, this phase feels like internal friction. You may notice irritation toward yourself. You catch judgments arising without external cause. You feel tempted to blame the past, the family, the work environment, the relationships, but the psyche insists on a different movement now. It asks you to withdraw the arrows you have been firing outward and feel their weight in your own hands. Take a quiet pause, breathe more slowly. Projection withdrawal is not an intellectual exercise, it is visceral. When you stop seeing others as the source of your depletion, you must face the grief of your own self-abandonment. This is where many people misunderstand Jung. The goal is not to accuse yourself, the goal is to reclaim agency. Picture a stage after the audience has left. The lights are dim, props lie scattered. For years, you perform to applause or criticism, adjusting your lines accordingly. Now the theater is empty, and the script dissolves. What remains is not nothingness, it is potential. In ordinary moments, you may notice how your body reacts when you imagine reconnecting, tightness in the chest, a subtle recoil, or, surprisingly, a calm neutrality. These bodily signals are not instructions to act. They are information. The unconscious communicates through the body before it forms words. Ethan encountered this during a walk one evening. He had been isolated for months, telling himself he needed no one. As he passed a cafe, he imagined running into an old friend. His body tensed instantly. Not fear, resentment. He realized he had never allowed himself to feel how angry he was about always being the one to adapt. That anger had been projected outward as "they drain me." Now it returned as energy he had never owned. Jung would say that the shadow is not integrated by suppression or indulgence, but by recognition. You do not act it out blindly, nor do you bury it again. You let it speak symbolically, consciously, without letting it dominate. This is where the real inward turn begins. At this stage, often around the deepest point of withdrawal, you are asked to do something deceptively simple and profoundly difficult. To stop defining yourself in opposition to others. No longer the one who gives too much. No longer the one who escapes. No longer the one who is misunderstood. Those identities were scaffolding. They helped you survive. Now they must come down. The psyche initiates what feels like a return to center. Individuation is not about becoming special. It is about becoming aligned. The ego, once defensive and exhausted, begins to listen instead of command. The self, the deeper organizing principle, emerges not as a voice, but as a direction. Imagine a compass that has been spinning wildly because of nearby metal. When the interference is removed, the needle steadies. It does not tell you where to go in detail, it tells you where north is. That is enough. In lived experience, this may show up as a subtle but firm sense of no where there used to be negotiation. or a quiet yes where fear once ruled. You are not performing boundaries anymore. You are inhabiting them. Lena reached this realization late one night while writing in her journal. She had been describing old conflicts, old betrayals. When her pen slowed, she wrote almost without thinking. I was never asked what I wanted, and I never answered when I knew. That sentence shifted everything. The anger softened into clarity. The silence she had chosen was no longer punishment. It was incubation. Jung believed that individuation requires the ego to relinquish its fantasy of control and enter a cooperative relationship with the self. This is not submission, it is alignment. When this happens, energy returns not as adrenaline, but as steadiness. Take another quiet pause. Let the compass image settle. Now something sacred enters the process, not religious in the doctrinal sense, but numinous. You may feel as though life itself is watching, waiting. The cutoff begins to reveal itself as a calling disguised as withdrawal, not a call to solitude forever, but a call to truth. This is where unconscious signals intensify. Dreams become vivid, coincidences feel charged. You may encounter words, image, or people that resonate unexpectedly. These are not instructions from outside, they are reflections of an inner realignment. David experienced this when he began practicing active imagination without naming it as such. He would sit quietly and let images arise. One recurring image was a bridge half built over a river. On one side stood figures from his past, on the other, an empty landscape. Over time, he realized the bridge was not meant to be finished all at once. He did not need to return to everyone. He needed to cross toward himself. Jung would say that the self communicates through symbols because symbols bypass the ego's defenses. When you honor these signals not by acting impulsively, but by listening, you participate consciously in your own individuation. And yet, this stage is fragile. There is a temptation to crystallize the cutoff into identity. I am someone who needs no one. This is a defense masquerading as wisdom. True individuation does not harden, it clarifies. In practical terms, this may mean allowing limited, intentional contact rather than total isolation. Or it may mean maintaining distance without resentment. The form varies. The principle does not, you are no longer reacting, you are responding from center. Sophia tested this when she received a message from a family member she had cut off. Instead of automatic engagement or automatic avoidance, she paused and felt into her body. There was no urgency, no dread. She replied briefly, honestly, without explanation. The exchange ended there. She felt no collapse afterward. That was how she knew something had changed. Jung believed that when individuation progresses, relationships reorganize themselves naturally. Some dissolve permanently. Some reappear in new forms. The psyche no longer needs extreme measures to protect itself. And once you see this, the silence transforms again. It is no longer an escape, no longer a confrontation. It becomes a place of orientation. The quiet room is now a center, not a hiding place. The lamp illuminates a path leading outward, not back to the old world, but forward into a more truthful participation with it. We are approaching the final movement of this journey. where the question shifts one last time, not why did I cut everyone off, and not even who am I without them, but something more exacting. The room you entered at the beginning now feels different. It is no longer a shelter against intrusion, nor a chamber of reckoning. It has become a threshold. The lamp that once hummed over emptiness now reveals something simple and uncompromising. A clear space where you stand alone without being lonely. Number 4, the cutoff completes its purpose and dissolves into choice. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They believe the story ends with isolation or with reconciliation. But psychologically, neither is the point. The true completion arrives when silence is no longer reactive, when you are no longer cutting people off from something, but standing with something your center, the ego, once frantic and defensive, has changed its posture. It is no longer gripping the steering wheel. It listens. The self does not shout instructions. It offers orientation. You feel it as a quiet authority that does not need witnesses. This is what maturity feels like from the inside. Imagine a road at dawn. For years, you walked it in fog, adjusting your pace to others, afraid of stepping alone. Then you left the road entirely, retreating into the woods to escape the noise. Now you return not to the same road, but to a cleared path that runs through you. The fog lifts not because the world changed, but because you did. In daily life, this completion expresses itself without drama. You answer some messages and not others. Without guilt, you decline invitations without explanation.